If I have not gotten a chance to meet you, I am John. I get to be on the leadership team here at St. Thomas. I also get to serve as a pastor with Church of the Park here in town, and it's great to be with you. This is our second week in our series on liminal spaces, the spaces and the experiences and the moments of life that can feel like they're in between two realities or somehow an overlap of realities. These can be spaces like hospital waiting rooms that are in between the world outside and the room in which you meet with the doctor. They can be moments and spaces like graduating school, where you're exiting and transitioning out of one really specific context and into another. Liminal spaces can also be like birth and death or wedding ceremonies, in places where the reality of the eternal seems to somehow infuse the here and the now. And I bet if we went around the room, we could all share examples of liminal spaces that we really, really like and find a lot of joy in, and we could also probably name some liminal spaces that are hard for us and are filled with confusion. And probably some liminal spaces in between, like some liminality, like summer break, which is awesome for students and teachers, and terrible for parents who really like having 8 hours by themselves at home. But I think that's part of the point with liminal spaces, is they don't fit nicely into our normal categories. They can be confusing, they can be nuanced, they can be paradoxical. But I think the beauty of liminal spaces is that they often force us to loosen our grip on how we're perceiving ourselves and our place in the world, which means that they can also become the windows for God to show up in some pretty beautiful and unexpected ways. That somehow, like, liminality asks us to be open to a dynamic and creative God who's dancing in the in-between and somehow pulling us along. But there are spaces where it's hard to say yes to that dance. And so this morning, we're looking at one of those spaces that's hard to say yes to, which is what we might call the wilderness. And when I say the wilderness, I mean the moments of life that can feel dry and arid and lifeless, the moments where we don't know where we are, or even where we're going, or even if we're on a path. The wilderness moments can be moments where we feel really alone and really forsaken, moments where we're walking with pain and suffering. Many of you and people I know will articulate the dark night of the soul. This can also be the wilderness experience. But the wilderness is the first liminal space we are visiting in this series, because Lent is the time where we reflect on and imitate Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. And Jesus' 40 days, of course, is an imitation of Israel's 40 years. So this morning, we're going to spend some time in the 40-year wilderness. The text that we have for this morning comes from Deuteronomy 8, and for context, Deuteronomy 8 is all of Deuteronomy is this one long speech that Moses gives to the Hebrew people right before they enter the Promised Land. Like, it's year 39, and everything that they've been hoping for is about to come true. And so Moses, in his wisdom, recognizing that reality is about to change, that fortunes are about to get better, is urgent to give a message to the Israel people. And so that is where this text comes from. And it's a little bit lengthy text. Do we have the slides? Okay. I know that I would really like to take a deep breath right now, so I'm going to ask John to read it so that I can just listen along as well.
The whole commandment that I command to you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you, and let you hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciples his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. So you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing out in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Take care, lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest, when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through great and terrifying wilderness, with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you, to do you good in the end. Beware, lest you say in your heart, my power and might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. And if you forget the Lord your God, and go out after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so shall you perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God.
I feel like we should all take a big deep breath. That was a long text. If you will allow me, it is helpful for me to start by acknowledging that there are parts of that text that disrupt me. There's a lot of beautiful parts in there. And in between some beautiful parts, there are some parts that bug me. Not just the fiery serpents and the scorpions. I hope that bugs everyone. But the parts of, well, let me say this. When we talk about wilderness experiences, at least for me, I am including in that term real moments of human suffering. When I use the word wilderness, moments of my own suffering and my own story bubble into my brain. And one of the most disturbing ideas, one of the ideas that will probably get me to walk out of a room like this faster than anything else, is the idea that God chose for me to suffer. That God willingly desired me to experience pain and darkness. It's in my day job as a pastor for folks who are living in the liminal space of homelessness, there is nothing more dehumanizing than the idea that God chose for those people to be there. But there are moments in this text and moments elsewhere in Scripture that can get used to suggest that the infinitely loving God of the universe actively wants us to suffer or experience pain. That God is somehow intentionally willing the wilderness for us. And I don't want that to be the lesson of this morning. That this text is in some way a liminal space for me because it disrupts me, but also invites me to consider a beautiful God who might still be in the middle of it all. And so to sit with that liminality, it is helpful for me to reconsider Jesus' wilderness experience. Because at the end of Jesus' 40 days, the story tells us that he wasn't actually alone. That there were angels there that were attending to him. And then from that point on, in the rest of the Jesus story, there are moments where the narrative will say that Jesus escapes to an isolated place to pray and to be with the Father. Moments where he needs rest, or moments where a big moment is coming up and he has to prepare. And the word that gets translated in those moments to isolated place is eremos, which is the same word that gets translated to wilderness at the start of the story. That somehow Jesus' experience in the wilderness leads him to this place of understanding that what he originally thought would be a forsaken place is actually the place where he gets to experience the greatest amount of intimacy with the Father. That eremos is no longer a place void of God's presence, but the place where it might be realized the most. And the Hebrew cousin of eremos is midbar. It's the wilderness of Deuteronomy 8, and the 40 years of Israel's wandering. Moses, I think, at the end of 40 years, has the same sense of understanding that Jesus gets, which is the moments when they feel most forsaken are also the moments that they are most sustained. It's real footprints in the sandy, I acknowledge it. But last weekend, Bo and I went and saw Scott Erickson, and some of you might know Scott Erickson as Scott the Painter on social media. He's a visual artist, and he has a one-man show right now where he uses his visual art to guide a discussion about not giving up on ourselves in the moments where we are most wanting to throw in the towel. And one of Scott's lines from the show is that the more that he experiences and reflects on life, also, I know Matt will never have to deal with hair. This is real annoying right now. Matt, if you're listening, it's a burden to have hair. One of Scott's lines from his show is that all of life starts to become this project of applying the wisdom of hindsight to the now. And when he said that line, it reminded me of all the moments that I've sat with people who have suffered, who have experienced pain, who have wandered through the wilderness and also spent enough time afterwards out of the wilderness to be able to look back and draw out lessons. And almost every time, I'll hear someone say something like this: that I would never want to go back to that time, nor would I wish what I experienced on my worst enemy, but I am grateful for it, and I wouldn't change it. That somehow who I am, who I have become because of my suffering, is so much more beautiful or gracious or resilient or faithful or trusting or courageous or empathetic or stronger than who I would have been if I never experienced it. Like over and over again, human wisdom can look back at the experience of the wilderness and say, that sucked. That was terrible. And something good came out of it. Something so good, it actually probably wasn't the product of my own hands or any other person's, but actually something bigger and better and other and outer, something that we call God. That somehow the distance of time allows us to look back and begin to recognize the companionship of God in the darkness. That somehow the gift of hindsight and the experience of becoming something new allows us to redeem the pain and the suffering by naming them as the places where death and resurrection overlap in our own stories, in the most liminal of spaces. And so when I apply that filter to Deuteronomy 8, Moses' words and wisdom get elevated out of God wanted you to suffer, and even out of something trite like everything happens for a reason. And now I can read them as the metaphors of hindsight. Moses knows Israel is about to experience a radical change in fortunes. And he's really, really urgent to say to Israel, once life is easy and great, once you're no longer dealing with fiery serpents and scorpions, don't think that you've arrived there because you're so amazing. You got there because Yahweh is amazing. But developing the eyes to see how God has shown up and is showing up in the midst of darkness can take practice. Practice that feels like testing and discipline. Practice the way that running is hard but increases an athlete's lung capacity and conditioning. The way that studying is hard but increases a student's capacity to do well on an exam. The way that weightlifting builds stronger muscle by creating 1,000 micro tears in muscles that grow back stronger and healthier. Or the way that toddlers learn how to walk in between the space where one parent lets go of their fingers and says, you can do it, and then the other parent is standing waiting to catch them saying, you did it. But in that space in between, there is space for trips and falls and bruises that cause us to wail at the top of our lungs for 10 minutes. But how often is it that when a toddler falls and bumps and bruises and is wailing at the top of their lungs for 10 minutes, that what they had all along was a parent who was ready to catch them, and that what they discover is that they've spent the most amount of their time crying while also beheld in the arms of their parents saying, it's okay, it is okay, it is okay, for long enough until the crying quiets and they can start to hear that voice. Having the eyes to see our cosmic parent next to us always, in good times and in bad, takes practice. And there often is no better teacher than pain, than the wilderness, which is not to say that when we suffer or feel lost, that we are to say to ourselves that somehow we aren't actually suffering, or that we should somehow believe that we aren't actually lost. But it is to say that when we are most acutely aware of our pain, we also get to be the most sure that we are not alone. The through line of Deuteronomy 8 is not get over your troubles or even get over yourself. The through line of Deuteronomy 8 is you are not alone. This is, I think, Moses saying, don't think for a second that a change in fortune, even a change into better fortune, is an indication of a change in God's love or favor or God's presence with you. The wisdom of hindsight is that when the world is darkest and bleakest, when we're most aware of the wilderness around us, that we indeed have a walking buddy. We have someone who can sustain us with manna, stuff in the world that we never thought was possible or even realized was available to us. We have someone whose voice can call creation and reality into something more than we expect it to be on our behalf. The wisdom of hindsight also says that the wilderness can reveal the parts of ourselves that are ripe and ready to die and be reborn into something more and something beautiful, something more like Christ. The wisdom of hindsight says that if in the wilderness we can pay attention and look for the clues and be open to the process, that somehow God is capable of pulling us further and deeper into who we were created to be all along. I'm always looking for people who are smarter than myself, who can say things better than me. So I'm going to finish with a quote from Paul Brandeis Rosenbusch, who was at one point a dean of spiritual life at Princeton. And I'll allow these slides to be our invitation into conversation. In Lent, we observe the 40 days that Jesus wandered in the wilderness, filled with trial and temptation. As it is with most of us, my personal sojourn often is located in the wilderness, winding within uncomfortable and uncertain terrain, filled with temptations and trials and a sense of aloneness. At some point in my life, however, I come across the words of another sojourner found in Psalm 139. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. Over time, the testimony of God's intimate presence of love found in this psalm has become my own, and while it did not and has not relieved me of my wilderness experiences, it allows me to understand my struggles in a different way, to feel less alone, and to redeem my life as a valid and even valued part of the wider sacred story of God. Maybe that is why I love Lent. In this season, it is permitted to reflect on the pain of our lives and to even acknowledge that there are times when God seems utterly absent. Christians spend their lives between the words of Jesus that ask, God, why have you forsaken me? And the others that proclaim, into your hands I commend my spirit. The testimony of Psalm 139 is that no matter where we go or what we do, whether we sense God or we don't, God is. God is present. Amen.